Hello and welcome. Tonight, we travel once more through the folds of time, not in search of heroes or triumphs, but into the darker corridors of the medieval past, where cruelty was not an accident, but often a deliberate tool. But don't worry, this won't be a harsh journey. You're safe here. The candles are lit, the night is calm, and there's a soft hush that hangs between your breath and the world. Perhaps you're already tucked beneath your blankets, head resting against the pillow, listening as your thoughts gently slow. Or maybe you're just seeking a little stillness after a long day. Either way, I'm glad you've joined me. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? There's something strangely beautiful about how these stories of long-ago lands and long-forgotten kings now drift softly into bedrooms across the world. From quiet apartments in cities that never sleep to tiny cottages nestled beneath snowy hills, our community of quiet listeners stretches across oceans and continents. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment below. I do read them. They remind me that even in darkness, we're not alone. And if you find comfort here, if these whispered histories help ease your mind or guide you gently towards sleep, consider subscribing. There's always more to explore, more shadows to gently trace, more forgotten pages to turn. Now, take a deep breath with me. Inhale and let it out slowly. There's no need to rush. Tonight's tale will be waiting, exactly where the past always is, just beyond the veil of memory. Because tonight, we step into a different kind of story. Not the shining legends of knights or saints. Not tales of beauty or devotion. No. Tonight, we visit the cold, merciless side of power. The side etched not in marble but in blood. We'll explore the lives of those whose names have become warnings. Monsters in the flesh, cloaked in crowns, armor, or holy robes. The cruelest people of the medieval world. But even in these dark stories, there is something to be learned. Something about fear, about survival, about what power does to the human soul when left unchecked. So settle in if you haven't already. The hour is late. The candlelight flickers. And our descent into the shadows of the past begins now. To understand cruelty in the Middle Ages, we first need to understand the world that shaped it. Close your eyes, if you like, and picture a land not just far away, but far behind us in time. A land without electricity, without medicine as we know it, without the gentle hum of modern life. A world lit by firelight, candles, torches, hearths, and shaped by iron, wood, and fear. The Middle Ages, roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries. A 1,000-year stretch of shifting empires, collapsing kingdoms, and endless, grinding uncertainty. Europe was not a continent at peace. It was a continent on edge. To be born in this era was to be born into struggle. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. They lived in thatched cottages or stone hovels, worked the land for nobles they would never truly know, and prayed each day that plague, war, or famine would pass them by. Life was fragile. Death familiar, and justice, if it could be called that, was often brutal, swift, and public. Rulers ruled not by popularity or consensus, but by fear, by spectacle, by the sword. Loyalty was currency, betrayal a daily threat. The concept of law existed, yes, but it bent easily beneath the weight of ambition. A lord who could shape a village's fate. A king's wrath could erase a family's name. And all across this world, cruelty wasn't always condemned. It was expected, even admired. Children grew up watching executions in the square. Heads on spikes lined the city gates. Burnings were not shameful secrets, but holy spectacles. It was an age where the line between justice and vengeance blurred easily, and where power was often measured not by how well you ruled, but by how many feared your name. But still, it would be a mistake to think all of medieval life was soaked in blood. There was beauty, too. Music, art, architecture, moments of compassion. But these flickers of grace often stood in stark contrast to the violence that framed them. The Middle Ages were a paradox. Cathedrals and torture wheels, illuminated manuscripts and rotting dungeons. Hymns of peace sung over fields still stained by battle. And through it all, figures rose. Men, and occasionally women, whose thirst for control, for dominance, for legacy knew no limits. Some hid behind religion. Others wore their cruelty proudly, like a badge of strength. But all of them left scars on history, so deep, we still feel them today. In this world of swords and shadows, cruelty was not always madness. Often it was strategy, a message, a warning, a throne held firm by rivers of blood. And so, as we continue deeper into this midnight history, keep that truth close. These were not outliers, not lunatics dropped into a peaceful age. No, these were products of their time, shaped by it, sharpened by it. And sometimes the age itself was the cruelest figure of all. His name echoes through the centuries like a chill wind slipping through broken stone. Vlad, III of Wallachia. Vlad Tepes. Vlad the Impaler. A man whose cruelty would one day inspire legends of monsters and myths, but whose reality, somehow, was even more terrifying. When Vlad returned to his homeland of Wallachia in 1448, the land was in chaos. A fragile patch of soil caught between two giants, the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. It was a place of shifting allegiances, betrayal, and blood-soaked ambition. Vlad didn't merely inherit a troubled realm. He stepped into a storm, but he came prepared. His rule was not gentle. It was sharp-edged and absolute. From the moment he took power, he moved with cold purpose to crush disorder, to punish betrayal, and to make his enemies think twice before raising a hand against him. And so he turned to fear. One of his first acts as ruler was as symbolic as it was savage. He invited the boyars, the nobles of Wallachia, to a grand feast. They came, perhaps uneasy, perhaps expectant. They dined, they toasted, and then, without warning, Vlad had them all seized. Some were impaled on the spot. Others were marched into the mountains and forced to build a fortress for Vlad until their bodies gave out. The message was clear. Loyalty would be rewarded with survival, disloyalty with horror, but impalement, that slow, agonizing execution by wooden stake, became more than just a punishment under Vlad. It became a signature. Imagine, if you can, the hillsides of Wallachia dotted with the bodies of condemned, writhing in silent agony on tall, sharpened poles. Forests of death, a landscape of warning. This was no legend. This was policy. And Vlad did not look away from it. According to some accounts, he dined among the impaled, sitting calmly at his table, breaking bread as their blood seeped into the earth. Whether true or embellished, the story survives for a reason, because it fits. Because even in a world already accustomed to brutality, Vlad's method struck a darker chord. He did not discriminate in his terror. Ottoman soldiers, Saxon merchants, suspected traitors, anyone who threatened his rule or questioned his resolve could find themselves hoisted above the earth, skewered to the abdomen, left to die over hours, even days. It wasn't madness. It was a kind of terrible logic. Fear multiplied became a wall, and for a time it worked. Invaders hesitated. Rebels stayed quiet. Vlad's name became a whispered warning across borders. But power built on horror always trembles. Eventually, alliances turned. Enemies multiplied. And Vlad's reign, so soaked in blood, was pulled down with equal violence. Still, centuries later, we remember, not just because he was cruel, but because his cruelty was deliberate, theatrical, and profound. A ruler who turned his country into a canvas and painted his power in red. The monster that inspired Dracula was no myth. He was a man, a prince, a product of war and betrayal, and, for a time, the most feared name in all of Eastern Europe. Before dawn on a hot July morning in 1099, the city of Jerusalem lay silent behind its thick stone walls, ancient, holy, waiting. Then the gates broke, and all heaven and all hell descended at once. It had been years in the making. When Pope Urban II stood on a wooden platform in Clermont, France in 1095, calling on the Knights of Christendom to abandon their petty feuds and take up the cross, his words ignited something deep. Tens of thousands responded. Nobles and peasants alike, pilgrims with swords, marched across Europe and into the unknown. They were promised salvation, forgiveness of sin, a place in heaven. But when they arrived at Jerusalem, what they brought was something far more earthly, blood. The siege of the city had been long and desperate, but Once the walls were breached, there was no restraint, no mercy. The Crusaders surged in like a flood, and the city drowned. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were butchered in the streets. Men clutched children to their chests. Mothers screamed prayers into the air thick with smoke and steel. Eyewitnesses say the blood ran ankle-deep through alleyways once sacred. It was not a battle. It was a purge. And amid the slaughter, some paused and kneel in prayer, offering thanks to God for victory before rising to resume the killing. Temples burned. Scrolls turned to ash. Families were torn apart in the name of faith. The Crusaders looted what they could, desecrated what they could not, and left behind a silence heavier than any wall. It is said that when the papal legate was asked how to distinguish heretics from true believers during the massacre, he replied coldly, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The sack of Jerusalem set the tone for the crusading era, not just a clash of armies, but of absolutes, of divine justification twisted into cruelty, of men who believed they held heaven's sword, and so struck without remorse. And behind the armor, behind the banners and holy chants, there was something disturbingly human. Rage, vengeance, fear of the other. They weren't monsters. They were men. And perhaps that's what makes it worse. What happened in Jerusalem was an anomaly. It was a pattern. From Antioch to Acre, the Crusades carved their path through blood and bone, often targeting not only enemies of the church, but neighbors, strangers, even friends. Religious violence, once unleashed, does not choose its victims with care. Even today, echoes of those days ripple through history. A city deemed holy by three great fates reduced, time and again, to a battlefield. And in the end, who can say what victory truly looked like? The walls were won, but the soul of the city bled. So rest, if you can, with that thought, that sometimes the most terrifying cruelty comes not from wickedness, but from righteousness. In a modern world, punishment is meant to be hidden, quiet, clinical, sealed behind courtroom walls and prison gates. But in the Middle Ages, it was theater. Public execution was not simply justice. It was spectacle. Picture it. The town square filling slowly at dawn. Children weaving between the legs of their elders. Vendors shouting softly over loaves of stale bread. And in the center, a raised wooden platform stained by years of use. The people gathered not in horror, but in anticipation. When the condemned was led forth, bound in chains or rope, bloodied or broken, the crowd leaned forward. They jeered. They whispered. Some prayed. Others laughed. And when the punishment began, they watched. There was the gallows, of course. Hanging was common. A drop from the platform, a sudden lurch, and then stillness. But that was almost merciful. More often, the punishment fit the crime. Creatively, cruelly. Thieves might lose a hand. Adulterers, their ears. Those convicted of treason met a far darker fate. Hanged by the neck, but not until dead. Cut down while still alive. Then castrated. Their entrails pulled slowly from a slit in the abdomen and burned before their eyes. Finally, their bodies were beheaded, quartered, and the pieces sent to the corners of the kingdom. A message, a warning, a display. And always, the people watched. Children sometimes clutched their mothers' skirts and cried. Others clapped or sang. It was a day's event, a release, a gathering of fear and fascination. No one left unchanged. But it wasn't only peasants who met such ends. Even nobles, especially nobles, could be paraded and punished, because a public execution wasn't just about ending a life. It was about controlling the story. A traitor's screams became a monarch's authority. A burning heretic became the church's purification. In France, in England, in the German states, executions were held not in secret cells, but in open air. Torture wasn't whispered about. It was announced, demonstrated, applauded. There was something grotesquely democratic in it. In pain, all were equal. Of course, not every sentence led to death. But even the stocks, those wooden frames where people's heads and hands were locked, turned suffering into community sport. People would pelt the accused with filth, rotting vegetables, stones. A punishment designed not to kill, but to humiliate. And it worked, because shame is a blade sharper than iron. But underneath it all, behind the ropes and torches and jeers, lay something quieter. A fear. A fear that if you stepped out of line, if you spoke too loudly, worshipped wrongly, chose poorly, you could be next. And so, people watched. They watched and they learned, not just who held power, but what happened when you tried to take it away. It began with a whisper, a murmur in the fields, among calloused hands and tired backs, a restless silence between one harvest and the next. And then the whisper became a spark, and the countryside caught fire. This was 1358, northern France, a land battered by war, bled dry by taxation, and hollowed out by the Black Death. The nobles fought their endless feuds. The king grew ever more distant, and the peasants, those who tilled the soil, fed the armies, buried the dead, had nothing left to give. They called the uprising the Jacquerie, from Jacques, a common name for a common man. But the nobility spat the name like a curse. And for good reason. The rebellion spread like smoke. Serfs, laborers, craftsmen, men who had never held a sword, picked up scythes, hammers, and firebrands. They descended upon manors and castles, not just to protest, but to destroy. And they did, with fury born not from ambition, but from despair. The Jacques tore through noble estates. They slaughtered lords and ladies, burned manorial records, shattered centuries of hierarchy in a single swing. They didn't just kill, they mutilated. They made examples. They made statements. Because this wasn't just about hunger. It was about humiliation. Generations of bowing, of silence, of obedience. Unanswered prayers, unjust taxes, and fathers taken for wars that never came home. The rebellion was a scream centuries in the making. But it was brief. The nobles rallied quickly. Armored knights returned from foreign campaigns. Mercenaries were hired. The peasants were no match. And the revenge was merciless. Villages were burned. Survivors hunted. Fields salted. Thousands were captured, tortured, executed. One leader, Guillaume Cale, was lured into parley, then seized, dragged through the streets, and publicly flayed. Others were tied to horses and torn apart limb by limb. The land fell silent again, but not the same silence. This silence was heavier, more cautious, as if the very earth remembered. The Jacquerie was not the only peasant revolt in the Middle Ages, nor the last, but it remains one of the most brutal, both in its rising and in its fall. It taught the rulers to fear the masses, and it taught the masses that the cost of speaking out could be unbearable. Even so, rebellions would rise again. In England, in Germany, in whispers beneath the weight of centuries. Because cruelty, when pressed down hard enough, eventually bleeds upward. And sometimes, even the lowliest plowman can become the face of vengeance. If cruelty in the Middle Ages had a human face, handsome, calculating, and cold, it may well have been Cesare Borgia's. He was born into privilege. Yes, but not innocence. The son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was destined from birth to live outside the bounds of ordinary rules. His family name was whispered across Italy with both awe and disgust. Borgia, a name that dripped with scandal, seduction, poison, and power. At first, Cesare wore the robes of a cardinal, a prince of the church. But those robes chafed against his skin. He was no priest. What he craved wasn't salvation, it was dominion. And so, with his father's blessing, Cesare cast aside the cassock and picked up the sword. Italy at the time was not a nation. It was a patchwork of city-states and duchies, each with its own ambitions, its own armies, its own betrayals. Cesare saw it not as a puzzle, but as prey. He moved like a shadow over the Romagna region, one city at a time, one noble at a time. If they resisted, he crushed them. If they hesitated, he deceived them. If they bent the knee, he watched them just the same. Loyalty, after all, was just a delay of betrayal. And when betrayal came, Cesare did not hesitate. He once invited a rival commander to a private meeting, promising peace. Instead, the man was strangled on the spot. Another time, he held a feast for rebellious nobles, then had them seized mid-toast, their bodies flung into the Tiber River before the wine had even dried from their lips. Even his own brother, Giovanni, beloved by their father and seen as a rival, vanished one night. Days later, his body was fished in the river, stabbed through again and again. No arrests were made. No questions were asked, because everyone already knew. Cesare Borgia had no room for sentiment. What he had was vision. Machiavelli himself, yes, that Machiavelli, saw in Cesare the ideal prince. Ruthless, cunning, efficient. A man who understood that to build a state in a world of wolves, one must become the sharpest set of fangs. But behind the military triumphs, behind the gold-embroidered cloaks and carefully staged pageantry, there was always a trail of blood, towns sacked, bodies strung up on the city gates, rebellions drowned in silence and smoke. And yet, there was beauty too. Cesare married into nobility, wore the finest silks, and surrounded himself with artists, engineers, scholars. He dreamed of a unified Italy long before it became real. His court was a place of poetry and poison, a place where brilliance and brutality danced together in perfect step. In time, the tides turned. His father died. Enemies gathered. Fortune, that fickle goddess, abandoned him. Cesare fell, not in glorious battle, but in exile hunted, bleeding in a foreign land. But even in death, his legend lived on, because Cesare Borgia was not merely a tyrant. He was a symbol of ambition without limits, of cruelty sharpened into strategy, of a man who reached for heaven and pulled hell up with him. He was born into war. Richard of York, third son of a powerful noble house, came of age in the shadow of England's bloodiest dynastic struggle, the Wars of the Roses, a time when loyalty turned with the wind, and the crown was passed from hand to hand like a sword too hot to hold. But Richard was patient. He learned in silence, watched in shadows, and when the moment came, he reached out not just for power, but for permanence. In 1483, King Edward IV, Richard's older brother, died suddenly. The throne passed by right to Edward's 12-year-old son, but Richard, named Lord Protector, was entrusted to guard the boy's crown, and instead, he claimed it for himself. The princes, Edward and his younger brother Richard, were moved to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection. They were seen playing in the gardens, then not seen at all. The tower windows stayed lit, but the laughter stopped. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the two young boys. No trial, no funeral, just absence, a silence that has echoed through English history. And in that silence, suspicion bloomed. Richard took the throne, crowned Richard III, and ruled for only 2 years. But in that short time, he earned a legacy blackened by betrayal and blood. He was not a fool, nor a brute. He governed with discipline, passed reforms, stabilized finances. But none of that mattered. Not to history, not after the Tower, because power taken in darkness is remembered in darkness. Richard's reign was stalked by ghosts, real and imagined. Nobles defected, alliances cracked, and in 1485, a new challenger rose. Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian with a weak claim and a stronger sword. They met at Bosworth Field, a gray morning, muddy ground, the air thick with iron and dread. Richard fought like a man possessed. He plunged into the heart of the enemy lines, seeking Henry himself. He cut down standard-bearers. He nearly reached the usurper, but he was overwhelmed, struck down in the mud, his crown found hanging in a thorn bush. His body was stripped, slung over a horse, paraded through the streets, buried without ceremony, without reverence. Later, Shakespeare would immortalize him as a twisted hunchback, snarling for a horse, my kingdom for a horse. A villain, deformed in body and soul. Perhaps unfairly, perhaps not, because history remembers what it chooses. Was Richard a usurper? A child murderer? A desperate man clinging to a crumbling throne? Or merely the last echo of a dying age, where ambition bled through silk, and even kings disappeared into stone towers, never to be seen again? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. But in the cold halls of memory, Richard III walks forever with two shadows, small, silent, and missing. He walked with a limp, a remnant from a youth spent dodging arrows on the open steppe, a wound to the hip that never healed. It gave him a tilt when he rode, a rhythm when he walked, like the world itself bent slightly beneath his weight. His name was Timur, or Tamerlane, as the West would later call him, a shepherd of slaughter, a warlord crowned by carnage. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan, though no bloodline proved it. But he didn't need a document. His empire would speak for itself. In the late 14th century, Timur rose from the ashes of a fractured world, Central Asia torn between fading Mongol Khanates, Persian dynasties, and desperate city-states. And where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. He began with conquest, always conquest. Samarkand, Bokhara, Herat, Delhi, Baghdad, Damascus. Cities fell like grain before the scythe. His armies moved fast, disciplined, and remorseless. And when they arrived, they brought not just victory, but erasure. Timur was not content to defeat his enemies. He needed them obliterated. In 1401, he sacked Baghdad. The rivers ran red. The mosques fell silent. And in the city's heart, his men built towers. Towers of skulls, meticulously arranged, as if death were a kind of architecture. Damascus followed. Then Aleppo. Then the plains of Anatolia. In every place, the same pattern. Siege, slaughter, silence. Tens of thousands butchered in days. Men, women, children, no distinction. Because for Timur, cruelty wasn't a flaw. It was policy. It was power. But like Cesare Borgia, he was not a brute without culture. Timur loved poetry. He built gardens. He adorned Samarkand with tile work, so beautiful it seemed to glow beneath the moonlight. He welcomed scholars, funded astronomers, and debated theology with clerics. He styled himself as a patron of the arts, even as his boots tracked blood into every palace he entered, because he believed, perhaps truly, that beauty and brutality could exist side by side, that an empire built on skulls could still sing. But not everyone could hear the music. To his enemies, he was not a philosopher king. He was a storm, and when he finally turned his gaze toward China, his men feared the earth itself might crack. But Timur died before that final campaign began, his bones buried beneath an inscription that warned, "Whoever opens this tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." In 1941, Soviet archaeologists cracked it open. 2 days later, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Coincidence? Perhaps. But with men like Timur, the lines between myth and memory tend to blur. He left behind no lasting dynasty. Only ash, and stories, and bones beneath the sand. Long before cannons shattered walls and inquisitors lit their pyres, another kind of terror crept silently through the medieval world. It had no crown, no sword, only fleas, only rats, and death. They called it the Great Mortality. Later, the Black Death. But in its time, it needed no name. It was simply everywhere. It began quietly, in the ports of Italy, where merchant ships docked from the east. Men stumbled ashore, fevered and bleeding, collapsing beneath cathedral walls. Within days, the city coughed black blood. Within weeks, it emptied. Then it spread across mountains, rivers, borders, and Europe broke. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death swept through the continent like a second scythe, reaping what war and famine had left behind. It didn't discriminate, rich or poor, noble or peasant. Boils flowered beneath their skin all the same. Limbs turned black, tongues swelled. People died screaming, praying, vomiting blood into straw. Entire villages vanished, doors nailed shut, fields untended. Bells stopped ringing because there were no hands left to ring them. Historians estimate that between a third and half of Europe's population perished. Imagine that. Every third face gone. But the plague did more than kill bodies. It killed certainty. It frayed the fabric of faith. Priests died. Churches closed. Prayers went unanswered. People turned on one another, desperate for reason amid the chaos. Jews were blamed, beaten, burned. Lepers hunted. Witches accused. Fear demanded a scapegoat, and the Middle Ages gave it many. The social order fractured. The old hierarchies, landowners, kings, bishops, all seemed powerless in the face of invisible death. And when the plague withdrew like a tide, it left behind not peace, but pressure. Labor was scarce. Grain was scarcer. Prices rose. Wages were suppressed. Laws were passed to trap peasants on their lands. And when the people protested, they were crushed. What followed wasn't healing. It was anger, boiling, quiet, bitter. The kind that builds over seasons, over generations. You could feel it in the silence of the markets, in the mutters after sermons, in the eyes of children who grew up surrounded by ash. And so, rebellion followed. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but in England, in France, in the German states. Serfs who once bowed now burned manors. Townsfolk who once paid taxes now armed themselves. Because once you've seen the world end, once you've buried half of everyone you know, fear loses its teeth. The cruelty of the later Middle Ages, its uprisings, its retaliations, its crackdowns and campaigns, did not rise in a vacuum. They were born in grief, raised in hunger, hardened in injustice, and they remind us that before cruelty becomes an act, it begins as a consequence. A slow erosion of kindness, of hope, of trust, until nothing is left but fire. And sometimes the fire is all they had. If cruelty was a language of power in the Middle Ages, then torture was its grammar. It spoke clearly. It left no room for interpretation. In dark stone chambers beneath castles and courts, lit only by torchlight and echo, pain became preferred method of persuasion, not just to punish, but to extract, to confess, to silence. There was a rack, perhaps the most infamous, a long wooden frame, ropes tied to the wrists and ankles, stretched taut, and then turned, slowly. With every crank, joints popped from their sockets, shoulders, hips, elbows, knees, until the body sang with agony. Few endured it for long. Even the innocent admitted to crimes they hadn't committed, because the truth under the rack meant nothing. Only the screaming mattered. Then came the breaking wheel, a thick cartwheel laid flat, the condemned tied across it, their limbs shattered one by one with iron bars, arms, legs, ribs, until their body wrapped around the spokes like a grotesque sculpture. Some were left there for days, exposed to the elements, slowly dying beneath crows and sun. A spectacle, a lesson, and a warning. There were cages suspended in air, barely big enough to kneel. There were boots filled with boiling liquid, iron maidens spiked with myth and metal, hot tongs, thumbscrews, the pair of anguish, a device inserted and expanded inside the mouth, or worse, other places. Each one had a purpose. Each one had a message. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens to heretics. This is what happens to women who speak too boldly, to men who doubt the wrong priest, to strangers in the wrong village at the wrong time. And through it all, through screams muffled behind dungeon walls, society continued above. Markets opened, bells rang, priests prayed, because pain had become institutional, accepted, sanitized by ritual and robe. And perhaps worst of all, sometimes it was celebrated. Crowds gathered not just for executions, but for torture sessions. Children perched on shoulders, lovers held hands. They watched flesh rip as if it were theater. Because when cruelty becomes normal, it no longer shocks. It entertains. Yet, the most terrifying truth? Much of this was done in the name of virtue. Torture wasn't just political, it was theological. Confessions needed for the soul's salvation. Heresy rooted out for the health of the church. Witches purged to cleanse a village. Pain not as punishment, but purification. And so the rack became an altar. The wheel became a sermon. And the screams beneath the stone became the chorus of a world convinced it was doing God's work. But history remembers. And beneath the silence of ruined towers, you can still imagine the echo of iron against bone. A language of control, spoken fluently for centuries. Some crusades were fought across oceans, others to cross neighbors' fences. The Cathars were a quiet people, devout, pacifist. They lived in the sun-washed hills of Languedoc, southern France. Their faith was simple, austere, rejecting the opulence of the Catholic Church, favoring purity over power, spirit over structure. They believed the world was a battlefield between good and evil, light and flesh. And they lived accordingly. No riches, no bloodshed, just prayer, humility, and silence. But to the church, that silence was heresy. And in 1209, Pope Innocent III called for their eradication. What followed was not a war. It was an extermination. The Albigensian Crusade, named for the town of Albi, unfolded over 2 decades, a campaign of fire and sword not in the Holy Land, but within the very heart of Christendom. French knights descended upon their own soil, their own people. The most chilling moment came in Béziers. As crusaders prepared to storm the city, soldiers hesitated. There were Catholics inside, too. How would they know whom to spare? The papal legate, Arnold de Mauric, gave the infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." And so they did. Béziers was erased in a single day. Men, women, children, cut down in the streets, burned alive in churches. The bodies piled so high they choked the cathedral steps. Survivors were hunted through vineyards, slaughtered in cellars. The city bled, then burned, then vanished. And it was only the beginning. Castle after castle fell. Montségur, Minerve, Lavore, each one dragged down in blood and ash. Nobles who had protected the Cathars were executed. Entire populations displaced. Sacred texts torched. Stone melted by fire and fear. By 1229, the last Cathar stronghold crumbled. Not just a faith, but a culture was extinguished. And in the ashes, the church built new walls. Stronger ones. Ones designed to not just punish heresy, but prevent it. From this crusade rose the Inquisition, an institution born not in Rome, but in the smoking ruins of Languedoc. It would carry the lessons of the Cathar purge forward into future centuries. How to root out dissent, how to interrogate the soul, how to break a person in the name of salvation. The Albigensian Crusade wasn't just an act of religious violence. It was a blueprint for how mercy can be weaponized, how faith, when twisted tight enough, becomes a noose, and how easily a whisper of difference becomes a death sentence. So when we speak of medieval cruelty, we must remember, not all monsters wore crowns. Some wore mitres, and spoke in Latin. Some punishments were not meant to kill swiftly. They were meant to linger, to etch themselves into memory of the victim, of the crowd, of the kingdom itself. And nowhere was this more true than in the English ritual reserved for the gravest crime of all, treason. It began not in silence, but with spectacle. The condemned man, usually a noble, a knight, or once loyal servant of the crown, was paraded through the streets on a wooden sled, tied down, dragged by horse. He did not walk. He did not ride. He was pulled, faced a stone, spined a plank, through jeers and thrown refuse, through prayers muttered half in pity, half in fear. At the gallows, the crowd surged close. There would be no clean break of the neck, no mercy. He was hanged until nearly dead, his body swinging, spasming. But before death could claim him, he was cut down, still breathing. Then came the knife. His clothing was ripped away, his legs pinned, his cries, if any, swallowed by gas in the crowd. And before his eyes, his abdomen was opened, slowly. The intestines were drawn out, yards of them, and fed into a fire stoked just for this purpose. The pain was unspeakable, deliberate, and still it continued. His genitals were severed. His heart, if the executioner timed it right, was torn from his chest, still beating. And then finally, he was beheaded. But even in death, there was no rest. His body was quartered, cut into 4 equal parts, each one salted and sent to the corners of the realm, a castle wall in York, a city gate in Dover, a bridge in London, a message written in blood and bone. This is what happens when you defy the crown. It was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. And for centuries, it was the highest form of punishment in England, a ritual of cruelty so refined, so choreographed, it bordered on liturgy. And the people watched, not just because they were forced to, because they believed in law, in order, in divine right, and perhaps deep down in the need to see pain made visible, to see fear made flesh, to feel the breath in their own lungs and know it had not been theirs that day. Even children were brought to witness, so they would remember, so they would never forget, so they would never repeat the mistake. There were other horrors, yes, the breaking wheel, the stake, the cage, the iron mask. But none carried the same ritual gravity as this. It was more than execution. It was an act of national memory. And the echoes of those screams still hang over the old stone towers today. Not all cruelty in the Middle Ages flowed downward. Sometimes it rose from the dirt, from the fields, from the calloused hands of those long pressed into the mud. The year was 1381, and England simmered. The Black Death had passed like a shadow, wiping out nearly half the population. But those who survived were not rewarded, they were punished. New laws bound them to their lords. Wages were frozen. Taxes were raised. Even freedom had become a memory. And then came the final spark, a poll tax, levied equally on rich and poor alike. It was small in silver, but massive in insult, and so they rose. Farmers, blacksmiths, cobblers, wives, sons, tens of thousands. They gathered beneath banners painted with saints and slogans, marching not with chaos, but purpose. They were led by a man named Tyler. His voice was clear. His demands, simple. An end to serfdom, a lowering of taxes, and the right to live like men, not animals in the Lord's ledger. They marched on London, and the city opened its gates. What followed was a brief, terrible hope. The rebels stormed the Tower of London, once thought impenetrable. They dragged out the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer, two of the most powerful men in the realm, and executed them on the spot. Blood soaked the courtyard stones. And then they called for the king. Richard II was only 14. He rode out to meet the rebels, his face pale, his voice rehearsed, but he made a promise. He would hear them. He would grant what they asked. The crowd cheered, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed the world might bend. But cruelty, once seated, does not surrender easily. The next day, as Tyler approached the king's retinue to finalize terms, he was struck down, stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London, then run through by royal guards. The king turned to the stunned crowd and declared, "You have no leader now. I am your captain." And they, confused, leaderless, betrayed, dispersed. The promises were broken, the pardons revoked, the names remembered. Then came the executions. Rebels were hunted, tried en masse, hanged and rose from village trees. The message was clear. You may rise, but you will fall harder. Yet something had changed. Though crushed, the peasants' revolt marked a crack in the stone. It showed that fear could flow both ways, that even a boy king had to speak carefully when standing before the poor. And across the years, like wind through fields of barley, the memory of 1381 would whisper, that even the meek remember, that hope, however brief, leaves a scar, and that betrayal cuts deepest when it wears a crown. And now we come to the end. We have walked through palaces and prisons, through deserts choked in holy fire, through forests of impaled bodies and cities rebuilt upon skulls. We have heard the names, Vlad, Cesare, Richard, Timur, and seen the shadows they cast. But perhaps the truest cruelty we've uncovered is not theirs alone, because as we look back across these centuries, something becomes painfully clear. The medieval world was not some dark mirror held up to humanity. It was a portrait of us. We like to think we've grown past these things, that we have civilized the darkness. But cruelty doesn't die. It adapts. It wears new robes. It speaks new languages. It smiles when it strikes. And that's what makes these stories so haunting. Not because they are foreign, but because they feel somehow familiar. The men we've met tonight were not monsters conjured in nightmares. They were sons, brothers, fathers, lovers. They prayed, they feared, they laughed, and still they ordered the stake lit, the blade raised, the door to the cell shut tight. Cruelty, it seems, is not a stranger to the human soul. It is a tenant, dormant in peace, awake in power. And yet, even as we walked through fire and blood, there were flickers of light. There were Francis of Assisi, who chose poverty and gentleness over privilege. There were mystics, monks, heretics who whispered compassion when the world screamed for revenge. There were nameless peasants who fed the hungry, even as their own bellies starved. Because history is never just one story. It is many, darkness and dawn, bound together like threads in a worn tapestry. So if there's a lesson in these tales of iron and flame, perhaps it is this: that power unchecked breed horror, that fear, once weaponized, devours the soul, and that our greatest protection against cruelty is memory. To remember what was done, to say the names of those who suffered and those who ruled, to walk carefully, even now, through the corridors of power and the chambers of belief, because every age has its Vlad, its Inquisition, its wheel, its fire, its rack. But every age also has its watchers, its voices in the quiet, its storytellers. And tonight, that was us. So sleep now if you can, not in fear but in vigilance. The past is spoken. The rest is up to us.